The Democrats are the most corrupt party ever. I'm glad I walked away from them. The Republicans serve the people, not their donors. The actual problem isn't so much that the Democrats are corrupt, it's that the Republicans and the Democrats are corrupt. They're both bought and paid for by the same multinational corporations, private interests with a few exceptions on the Democrats' part. The NRA and fossil fuel industries do not spend as much money on Democrats as they do Republicans. Now, there are Democrats who are bought off by the fossil fuel industry and the NRA, like Jim Webb and Joe Manchin. Yes. But they're not nearly as bad as the Republicans in those fields. Now, the Democrats are let's put it this way, no different in many aspects, and are not that much better. For example, they both vote to deregulate Wall Street, and many Democrats, like Dianne Feinstein, support the deficit-increasing tax cuts for the rich that end up always resulting in massive deficits, and they do not increase wages. You can look at my last video on that. With that in mind, there are plenty of uncorrupted Democrats fighting the corrupt Democrats and the corrupt Republican Party, like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who beat Joe Crowley, a corrupt Democrat, and in my district, Brent Welder, who I plan to vote for. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different from my last video. I'm going to read you an article that proves that both parties are insanely corrupt, and that the Republicans are actually the ones who are more corrupt because they're the ones proposing this awful legislation. So just recently, Democrats joined forces with Republicans to hide racial discrimination practices in banks. Now, a lot of these Democrats and Republicans are bought off by the big banks, so this is an issue regarding money in politics, and these Democrats, many of them, care more about their money than their constituents, like Tim Kaine. That's right, Hillary's VP helped Republicans hide racial discrimination in the banks. Why? Because he's bought off by the big banks. So what exactly did Tim Kaine and the other 16 Democrats do and vote on? Well, they voted on a Dodd-Frank rollback proposed by Mike Crapo, a Republican, that was overwhelmingly supported by Republicans. And this would lift Dodd-Frank regulations, some of which, like the racial discrimination practices that the banks had to stop doing and prove that they stopped doing. A group of moderate Democrats, several of whom face re-election this fall in states handedly won by Trump, joined with Republicans in voting 67-31 to enact the first major rollback of the 2010 Dodd-Frank financial overhaul law. Now I hate when they call them moderate. Call them neoliberals. They're just as corrupt as conservatives. They're not moderates. Legislation would remove Dodd-Frank's mandatory stricter oversight for about 24 larger banks, those with assets of as much as $250 billion. The bill would give Federal Reserve regulators more flexibility in their oversight of large banks. Now, of course, people bought off by the banks would vote to undo for this, because it would loosen regulations on the banks and help them maximize profit and screw over consumers. And that's why this was proposed by Republicans bought off by the banks and supported by Democrats bought off by the banks. The legislation could allow J.P. Morgan, Chase, and Citibank the two of the very biggest banks in the U.S. to hold less capital relative to their assets, undercutting one of the 2010 Dodd-Frank law safety measures. Ooh boy, now that's a real kicker. No safety for you, consumers. Part of the legislation, the bill would weaken regulators' ability to enforce fair lending requirements by exempting 85% of the banks and credit unions from Dodd-Frank data reporting requirements designed to help identify discriminatory practices. Oh, would you look at that? So, Democrats support civil rights issues when it doesn't affect their donors, but when it does, they side with the racist Republicans and helping discrimination practices. Oh boy. Mike Crapo says, at a time of intense political polarization, we've proven we can work together and get things done. So look, a Republican is happy for deregulation and helping banks practice in discriminatory practices and fawns this achievement. So what does President Trump do? He said he was looking out for you. He told black people, what the hell do you have to lose? He said he was going to stand up to the elites, right? Well, what's Trump do? President Trump commended the Senate on the bill's passage, would sign it into law, the White House said. Oh boy! So Trump signs this happily into law to help the banks practice in discriminatory practices. Oh boy. Now you see, Donald Trump doesn't care about you. He especially doesn't care about minorities. He called Latinos thieves and rapists. Well, he was talking about illegal immigrants. Yeah, he's the one making it hard for them to come over here legally. Though Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and George Bush didn't help with that. He's making it harder than the last three. But, look, he's not standing up to the elite. So who were these 16 Democrats? Well, let's look. Doug Jones, Tim Kaine, Maggie Hassan, Heidi Heitkamp, Claire McCaskill, oh boy, Missouri, my neighboring state, Jane Sheehan, Debbie Stabenow, Michael Bennet. I love that Tim Kaine is right there. What were you thinking, Hillary? Oh yeah, you're bought off by the banks. Tom Carper, Christopher Coons, Joe Donnelly, Joe Manchin, Bill Nelson, Gary Peters, John Tester, Mark Warner. Well, look, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, they're not on the list. Why? Because they actually care for the little guy. They're progressives. They want to help you. They don't want the banks to get off with these practices. But, jank. But this is literal bipartisanship. And you know, that pun actually makes sense because the only bipartisanship that exists is bought and paid for by the big banks and multinational corporations. So if it's an issue that doesn't affect donors, they'll fight to the death, and the hashtag resistance Democrats will fight Trump on this. But if they're paid to support Trump on it, they will get the money out of politics. But as you can see, look at all the money these Democrats received from the banks, and you can see why they voted the way they voted. And look at old Tim Kaine over there. $2 million. $2.3 million. No wonder he voted for this legislation. The banks are paying him to keep him rich. And that's why Hillary chose him as her running mate. Because he's bought off by the banks, she's bought off by the banks, and Wall Street did not want her running with Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, because they knew if anything were to happen to her, impeachment, assassination, whatnot, they'd have the enemies of the banks running the country. They wanted a friend of the bank to run the country if anything happened to Hillary, and she obeyed her marching orders. There's one name on that list I would like to draw attention to, and that is Doug Jones. During the Alabama Senate race, a lot of people praised him as a prosecutor who brought down a Ku Klux Klan group for actual hate crimes. Unlike Jeff Sessions, who sentenced a Klan member to death for drug possession, Jones actually fought the Ku Klux Klan on race issues and prosecuted them on their hate crimes. So why would a guy who brought down the Ku Klux Klan vote for a racial discrimination bill? Well, as addressed already, he's bought off by the banks. And so, when it comes to money, he sides with his donors. When it comes to actual democratic causes, like civil rights, he'll follow the guides of JFK and fight hate violence and bring down the Klan. But when it comes to money, he sides with money. That's the problem. Home ownership is the biggest builder of wealth in America and is still affected by the history of segregation, Jim Crow, and redlining. It fuels every indicator of discrimination in this country and is one of the best examples of manifestation of white supremacy. Housing discrimination relegated African Americans to homogeneous poor black communities with underfunded, segregated schools. Poorer schools create the education gap. The education gap creates unemployment disparities. Unemployment creates poverty and the phenomenon called black-on-black crime. Poverty leads to the inability to acquire affordable housing, which relegates black people to low-income communities, which leads to underfunded schools, which leads to more crime, and so on and so on. It's a vicious circle. A recent report by the Center for Investigative Reporting along with Reveal News uncovered how U.S. banks systematically prevent blacks and Hispanics from becoming homeowners. JP Morgan Chase paid $55 million in January to settle charges that it discriminated against black and Latino borrowers. In 2011, Bank of America handed over $335 million for making its minority customers pay more than white customers for the same loans. A federal lawsuit against Wells Fargo alleges that the bank discriminated against Philadelphia's black and Latino borrowers since 2004. See, so it's the banks discriminating against minorities now, and when Dodd-Frank was proposed and passed, it was designed to prevent this kind of practice. It is an indisputable fact that many banks treat their black customers unequally. The only reason we know this is that banks are required to report demographic data on most mortgage loans. That data is publicly available to anyone who wants to look at it. This was a result of the Dodd-Frank legislation proposed by Democrats, so we'd know and punish the banks for it. Under the new proposal, only the largest banks will have to report demographic data, which means that it will be impossible to find out if the other banks will discriminate. If the law passes, these banks will be able to deny black customers without fear of repercussion or lawsuit. And you see, that's why I bought off. Politicians supported it because the banks who fund their campaigns wanted it. The Democratic Party could have signed out that provision to the public and made a fuss. They could have called it racist because it is racist, which would have made the legislation lose support. They could easily have refused to vote for this bill unless that specific provision was stripped away. Senator Doug Jones from the state of Alabama voted for it. Doug, you're a disappointment. That's all that Wall Street money. Yes, it is. Stop taking it. This is the Democratic Party. Let's be clear. The Democratic Party is only a viable party because of the black vote. In 2016, 88% of blacks voted for the Democratic candidate, while only 37% of whites voted for Hillary Clinton. According to exit polls by USA Today, even before the most recent election, according to Pew Research, only 40% of whites identified as Democrats. Why? That's because the Democrats were the party that passed the Civil Rights Bill. If not for black voters, there would not be a Democratic Party. Without the black vote, the Dems would lose every election at the local, state, and national level. The Democratic Party's leadership knows this. The Republican Party knows this. And that is... Whew, Democrats. You better start supporting JFK again. Yet, Republican Democratic politicians, repeatedly refuse to stand up for the issues that affect black people the most. They continue to confirm President Trump's federal court appointees who will hear cases of police brutality and voter ID law discrimination, despite the fact that he has failed to nominate a single African or Latino judge to the federal branch. So, they're helping Trump. Trump's doing these awful, bigoted things, and they help these certain politicians, Doug Jones, Tim Kaine, McCaskill. They ignored the suggestion that they filibuster every bill until the Senate and House looked at gun control legislation to curb violence that affects black communities disproportionately. They caved on the Deferred Action for Children arrivals vote during the recent government shutdown. We often forget how immigration laws disproportionately affect African and Caribbean immigrants. Yes, they harm non-white immigrants. Well, white immigrants from Europe can come over here more easily than anyone from a non-white nation. That is Republican doing. That was Gingrich, and Clinton signed it into law. What if we supported valid third-party candidates who aren't beholden to an agenda to the Democratic apologists? What if we, even in one single election, wrote in our own choices? What if we supported participating in this antiquated binary system choices? So this is what smart black voters are doing. They acknowledge that the Republican Party is racist, so they're looking for a non-racist third party to basically say, hey, look, Democrats, you want us, you have to earn us. Well, let's put it this way, dumb black voters are going straight for the Republican Party. They basically vote against their own interests, because after all, this legislation was overwhelmingly supported by Republicans, proposed by Republicans, signed into law by Republicans. That is why the Republican Party must die. Now I want to make one thing abundantly clear. This was overwhelmingly opposed by progressives and liberals. It was supported by conservatives, neoconservatives, and neoliberals, bought off by the banks, and even libertarians. Many libertarians don't believe in protected classes. I know the rational tinker will bite my head off if I stereotype libertarians. There's my response shout out. One thing that does annoy me about libertarians is when they think this guy, Sam Brownback, is a better politician than Bernie Sanders, based solely on his gun and economics policies. Even though Bernie actually supports more libertarian causes than this guy. Bernie opposed the Patriot Act. He supports marijuana legalization. He is a non-interventionist. He supports loosening up our immigration laws. He's more libertarian than Brownback, who time and time again has opposed marijuana legalization. As a senator, he voted for the Patriot Act. He does not believe that privacy rights exist, and he supported the war in Iraq and perpetual war. But yeah, conservative Republicans suck more than anything. Neoliberal Democrats, libertarians, or even liberal Democrats, weak liberal Democrats, progressive Democrats are awesome. Actually, neoconservative Republicans are actually worse than conservative Republicans. And Trump sucks, Brownback sucks, Pence sucks, Bernie's awesome. Like, share, subscribe, I talk about politics, entertainment, you name it. So if you're not a progressive, you'll find content here that you'll like. That's not politics.